Welcome to the Human Experience Podcast, the only podcast designed to fuse your left and right brain hemispheres and feed it the most entertaining and mentally engaging topics on the planet. As we approach our ascent, please make sure your frontal, temporal and occipital lobes are in their full upright position. As you take your seat of consciousness, relax your senses and allow us to take you on a journey. We are the Intimate Strangers. Thank you for listening.
Welcome to another episode of the Human Experience Live Show. My guest for today is Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-H. Peter is the author of Noumenautics, a book in which he looks at the interplay of psychedelics, philosophy, consciousness, and metaphysics. Peter completed his degree in Continental Philosophy at the University of Warwick and achieved his PhD at the University of Exeter, where he teaches both philosophy and skills on writing. He's been featured on platforms such as TEDx, discussing the reemergence and hidden history of the usage of psychedelics and their connection to philosophy, science, and consciousness. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for making the time. Welcome to HXP.
Thank you very much, Xavier. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the chat.
So, Peter, let's kick this off by credentialing the conversation a little bit. Tell us about your education and how you got into this work.
Okay, well, as a child, I was always known as a sort of little philosopher. So I suppose that's always been part of my character. But I guess, when I was about 17, I wanted to do Eastern philosophy because my father had a book on Jnana Yoga. But at the time in Britain, that didn't exist as a degree. So I did Western philosophy instead. And got heavily into certain German philosophers like Kant and Nietzsche. And then later on in London, I started teaching philosophy in a college there in South Kensington in London. And the college roped me into teaching the philosophy of religion and theology, and that wasn't really my thing at the time. But I thought, okay, why not? And part of that included William James and his great book of 1902 called The Varieties of Religious Experience, wherein he talks about mystical states induced by chemicals such as nitrous oxide and ether. And so I thought, okay, this is interesting stuff, and was quite alien to me. But then concurrent to that, I was walking along these fields in Cornwall, and my brother, who was a sort of amateur mycologist, said, "Look, Peter, I think these are magic mushrooms there." So, and there were, quite a few. I mean, 100. Never found it that many again in one place. But anyway, I picked them, dried them, sort of checked out that they were not poisonous or whatever, and tried them. And it sort of changed my world. It just sort of made me realize the power of the human mind. And then when I went to see the philosophic literature, especially philosophy of mind on it, there just wasn't that much. So I thought, relatively speaking, I thought I'd, have a stab at it myself, and that's why I wrote Noumenautics, sort of, just sort of combining philosophy and psychedelics in a way, and I'm still sort of involved with that whole project.
Yeah, I mean, what does Noumenautics mean? What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's a word I made up. So, but what it means to me, it's a combination of the word noumena and the word psychonaut. So the word noumena comes from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He divided the reality into phenomena, which is the world we see around us in terms of time and space and causality and so on, and noumena, which means the world in itself, the world as it really exists without our human filter, as it were. Mm-hmm. And so it's a combination of that because, it's intimating in the book that you're getting a glimpse of noumena. You're not merely hallucinating, you're sort of getting a glimpse of reality in itself. And at the same time, it's based on the word psychonaut, which comes from another German philosopher called Ernst Jünger. He coined that in 1970. Jünger was a friend of Albert Hofmann, who invented or discovered LSD.
Sure.
In fact, in Albert Hoffman's book, LSD, My Problem Child, he he devotes a whole chapter to Ernst Jünger. But anyway, so Jünger comes up with this term psychonaut, which basically means an explorer of the mind via chemicals. So the book is a combination, really, of that exploration, but also with a touch, well, more than a touch of philosophy.
Huh. Okay. So, let's break this down a little bit. When we're looking at consciousness, how do we define what consciousness is?
Well, that's a huge question, as you know. And I in the PhD I completed quite recently, I've got a chapter devoted to that question, really. I prefer the word sentience, which is an umbrella term, which includes consciousness, but is more than consciousness. So for me, consciousness is opposed to subconsciousness, but both of those are forms of sentience. And within that, we can distinguish many different modes. For example, we can distinguish reason and knowledge, the power of reason, knowledge. We can have another category of perception, which includes the traditional five senses, sight, hearing, and so on, but also perhaps more than that, like perhaps another sense that Whitehead calls causal efficacy, which is a kind of primal sensing of emotion, the emotion within the world. We can also talk about other forms such as the speed of consciousness, the duration of the present, the species present as it's known. We can talk about memory, imagination, and then we can subdivide that into dreams and hypnagogia, mystical states. I mean, there are many elements that make up what we can call sentience, but I think you can at least list it, enumerate it. One way that I like to think about it as well, more generally, is from Bertrand Russell, and he says, the mind is that which we know without inference, right? So what that really means is we know the physical objects around us by inference. We see the colors and whatever, and we infer that those colors and tastes and whatever were caused by external objects. But our consciousness itself, the colors we have, the qualia as it's known, the experience, that we don't infer. That's directly known by us. So that's a quite useful distinction, I find.
So I mean, surely this aspect of sentience puts us at the top of the species, versus pre-hominid apes or something like that, sort of rummaging around for these hallucinogenic mushrooms. These shrooms affects us differently than these other species. I mean, would you presume that?
I would assume that, yeah, but at the same time, it's hard to know what it's like to be in other species. I mean, they did this really interesting experiment last year where they gave MDMA to an octopus, and we don't know what it was like to be an octopus on ecstasy. However, ecstasy used to be known as empathy, and the behavior of the octopods was quite strange because they started getting very cuddly and, sort of seemingly empathetic. So it seemed to affect them in the same way, even though the octopus brain is very, very distinct from our human brains. So, these things, I mean, human neuroscience is still in its infancy, and the neuroscience of other creatures even more so. I mean, it's my personal belief that sentience is not, you don't necessarily need a brain to have sentience. And again, this was what my doctorate was on, something called Panpsychism, which is the view that sentience exists throughout nature, but in different degrees, just like the complexity of matter exists throughout nature, but in different degrees of complexity. So I'd say there's a basic form of sentience, perhaps not consciousness, but something more like akin to subconsciousness, even in plants, but going down, all the way down.
Mm-hmm. You talk about something that you termed a hard problem of consciousness, and then you get into qualia. What are these things? What is the hard problem of consciousness?
Okay, well, the hard problem of consciousness was coined by an Australian philosopher called David Chalmers in 1995, but it's an old problem. It's also known as the mind-matter problem, the mind-matter mystery, and it goes back hundreds of years, if not thousands. But it's basically this. What is the relationship between matter, or the physical, and mind, or consciousness, or sentience? It's it's a real mystery to philosophers, psychologists, scientists, everybody, because essentially it boils down to this: how can something that moves, in other words, like impulses within the brain or the passing of chemicals, how can something that moves be the same as or cause something that seemingly does not move, such as an emotion, happiness or sadness or something like this? How does emotion cause emotion? Is it that the movements within the brain or whatever it may be are identical to a mental state? That seems very hard to believe. It was believed in the mid-20th century in a theory called psychoneural identity theory. It's difficult to believe because, for example, neurons have certain spatial properties, like the general patternation over time, and their correlated imagery, let's say a purple triangle, has different spatial properties. Therefore, you'd have to say that the same thing has two sets of spatial properties, which seems absurd. So when people sort of dismissed that identity theory, that mind and brain were identical in the mid-20th century, what emerged was really something called emergentism, of functionalism first, but emergentism, which is generally the idea that the brain causes the mind to exist. But the problem with that is there are no known laws of nature that exhibit that causation. There's it's called in philosophic terms, it's called a transordinal nomology, or bridge laws. These are not laws of nature as we understand it. Secondly, it's problematic because if you want to believe in free will, in mental causation, which most philosophers do today, it's very hard to say how something that emerges, the mind, can feed back and make your legs move and so on and so forth. There's a problem of mental causation. So that in a nutshell is the hard problem of consciousness, how mind and matter relate. And although a number of people think they know the answer to that, nobody agrees, and there are several theories out there.
So this is the main sort of concern that philosophers are looking at.
It's the main concern for, I should say, philosophers of mind, such as myself.
Okay.
But other philosophers, they look at ethics, and they're not concerned with us at all. Might look at political philosophy or epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, or so on and so forth. But I think that this is a fundamental mystery to not only philosophers, this hard problem of consciousness, but to scientists as well. I was just reading a book by Carlo Rovelli called The Order of Time, a physicist, and he brings in a lot of philosophers actually, but his understanding of sentience, of consciousness, is quite limited, and I'm reading it and I'm thinking, listen, there's so much more that could be said about time, the nature of time, when you involve consciousness, than can be said by simply mathematics and physics per se as we have it today. So it's my belief that in the future the philosophy of mind and psychology will be fused with physics, basically to create a greater cosmology that explains more of the sort of anomalies and phenomena that we're working on today.
Okay. It's interesting. We're building the story here. I mean, you talk about how the brain filters subjectively consciousness, right? So, I mean, how does that work? How is the brain filtering what we experience and see?
Well, I suppose that due to evolution, we have senses for certain parts of reality. The sort of basic example would be the electromagnetic scale. So we humans can see the colors that we see, but that's only a fraction of the electromagnetic scale. Other animals like bees or deer can see ultraviolet. They see, when a bee sees what we see as a plain white flower, they might see a beautiful pattern or whatever, right? And that's just electromagnetism. There are, we can only also hear a fraction of auditory waves, like sound waves. We are blind to gravitational waves, except on the macro scale. We're blind to micro scales as well, the machinations within atoms and so on. We are also blind to the sentience, mostly blind to, I should say, the sentience of other organisms. This is another problem in that philosophy of mind called the problem of other minds. How do I know that you have consciousness? I know that I have consciousness. It seems that I infer that you have consciousness. But I can never be sure. And if I can't be sure about humans, how about other animals? I mean, Descartes, the founder of modern mathematics and modern philosophy, René Descartes, he thought famously that only humans have, minds, and not even his dog had a mind. They were just more like automata, robots. He did make an exception for magpies, strangely, but generally there's this problem that we're blind to the sentience of others. We're blind to most of the physical forces of which our science tells us is out there. So we are very, very, and why are we? Because, well, for example, Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, he said, we've only evolved to perceive that which is of practical utility to us, practical use to us. We just, in our evolutionary past, we just have not had the need to see, X-rays and infrared and whatever. Today, of course, we've got technology which can translate those waves into audible waves for us, with X-rays and infrared glasses and so on. But it's quite clear that we are filtering the world according to our needs. And perhaps it's the case that we are simply not equipped to understand reality as it really is. But at the same time, we seem to be making some headway in understanding more and more about what's out there.
Yeah, and this is where psychedelics kind of come in, right? Because they change those filters. They allow us to see this other realm, whether we're entering it or something else, or whether it's sort of removing this filter that we've got sort of set up in our paradigms, our belief systems. And you talk about how psychedelics are reemerging into mainstream culture, but also you talk about how much it's influenced the philosophy of our past. So let's get into modern philosophy now, where it is, but also how we got to the place we're at now. Because you talk about Plato drinking ergot, which is the precursor to LSD, and it seems that there are more and more of these experiences that are denoting this sort of, I don't know, this presence of psychedelics throughout human history.
Yeah, no, it's quite a fascinating line of inquiry, really. So Albert Hofmann, whom I mentioned, who discovered LSD, he wrote a text saying that he believed that, well, let me go back. So in ancient Greece, 2,500 years ago or so, there was this religious festival known as the Eleusinian Mysteries. And these were held, there was a greater and a lesser mystery, but these were held once a year. And everyone who could speak Greek was allowed to partake of this. And ultimately, it involved taking a potion of a specific dose after one has fasted, and then going into this darkened temple. And but one was forbidden to speak about it. And however, it's clear that the great philosophers, like all the other Greeks, were initiates in these mysteries. And Plato, one of the greatest really of the ancient Greek philosophers, although he didn't explicitly write about it, he intimates it quite a lot, like characters walk along the river Ilissos, which is the location of the lesser mysteries and so on. And he talks about, he says that he wants to be counted as a mystic, as amongst the mystics. Mm-hmm. And then he talks about this great vision, or in a few books. Well, in one book, two books particularly, the Phaedo especially, and the Phaedrus. And he talks about his soul leaving his body and so on in this vision. And then thereafter, he tries to come up with logical reasons as to why mind and matter are not identical. In fact, are two separate substances. And this is what we call in philosophy substance dualism. So it seems that these visions inspired his dualism, which was extremely influential in in Western thought. I mean, a lot of people, like Nietzsche says, Christianity is Platonism for the people, right? And so Hoffman then thought that within these mysteries there was the potion was psychoactive and contained ergot. Why? Because, well, there were these barley plains adjacent to the Eleusinian mysteries, and ergot is a fungal parasite that grows on wheat, barley, and so on. So there's other theories as to what it was as well, but it seems quite likely that it was some kind of psychoactive substance. I mean, I should say at the time, wine in ancient Greece wasn't like wine today. It was highly psychoactive substance in itself. So it was not unknown, these substances. Anyway, so it's if Whitehead, the philosopher Whitehead, is someone I deeply admire. He wrote that he famously wrote that all European philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. And if it's the case that Plato's philosophy was inspired by psychedelic intake, it means the whole legacy of Western philosophy really is, in one sense, one can sort of conjecture, triggered by psychedelic intake. And of course, philosophy was the same as science until a couple of hundred years ago, really. So the whole of Western intellectual development, one could argue, has a debt to the role that psychedelics played in ancient Greece.
Yeah, and it seems like there is this reemergence happening now. I mean, people are talking about this. It's been in legislation. They're talking about decriminalizing magic mushrooms and peyote and these other compounds that are just seemingly just part of nature. I mean, this is something that's available to everyone. And it should be, right? So back in ancient times, have you noticed in your research that these psychedelic compounds were available to a certain class and not other people?
Well, there were some restrictions placed on them. Like I said, for example, then the kykeon, which was the potion in the Eleusinian mysteries, that was only allowed to be taken at the temple and administered by priests. However, there were other sort of concurrent Dionysian festivals going on as well, where it's likely there were other chemicals taken, but it was always in a ritual setting. There's one case actually in ancient Greece of an aristocratic youth who performs a sort of a mystery rite in his own home. In other words, he probably took the kykeon in his own home, and he's severely reprimanded by the state when that happens. I suppose because these, you see, in the Eleusinian mysteries were the function was to stop one fearing death. So there were, very sacred activities, and certainly nothing to be taken trivially or recreationally. But what happened historically was that those mysteries festivals, or the Eleusinian ones, were closed down by the Christians, or the Romans who had just converted to Christianity. So in the 5th century AD, Emperor Theodosius, who was a Christian, he closed it down. And after that, it seems that Christianity then, as you know, became very dominant, to say the least, in Western culture. And it seems that it monopolized all mystical states, and thus psychoactive compounds were sort of generally omitted from that, with some exceptions maybe. But I think now, with the Enlightenment a few hundred years ago, then we move away from Christianity to a certain extent. The church certainly hasn't got the power it once had here in Europe, at least, and in sort of Middle South America it still has more power. But certainly in Europe, Western Europe, it has very little power now, ostensibly at least. And so we can return to more pagan or more secular versions of spirituality that don't involve sort of an intermediary priest. And I think part of that is the taking of psychedelics as well. It's sort of like a kind of direct mystical experience. Some people say that this is a Western way of thinking about psychedelics, but I think it's a legitimate way of thinking about it. And so I think the prohibition on psychedelics that we've seen in the last sort of 50 years is a bit like the prohibition on alcohol in the US in the 1920s. It lasted, 10 years there. Mm-hmm. Prohibition LSD is probably going to last, about, 60 years or so. But we see it closing down now. I think the science is beginning to show that these compounds are relatively harmless. I remember Imperial College did this chart of the harms of drugs, and right at the bottom was psilocybin, the magic mushroom,
sure,
a compound. And so when the science is there, and when you realize that these psychedelic drugs at least don't cause harm, I mean, they don't, relative to like alcohol or cigarettes or whatever, or heroin perhaps, I think it's very hard. And moreover, when the science is showing that they have therapeutic potential as well. Again, it's, Imperial, but also Johns Hopkins, many universities now are showing this. It's very hard to maintain a line that psychedelics are somehow immoral or should be, kept criminal or even taken lightly. I mean, there's just the science and reason and history is just not on the side of these prohibitionists. So it's nice to see these drugs being decriminalized now, slowly but surely.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me. I mean, you talk about these main figures in philosophy like Sartre taking mescaline. You talk about Carl Jung, Einstein. I mean, and then you connect it to some of the greatest thinking that's ever occurred into psychedelics. I mean, is this something that should surprise us? Should we be surprised that psychedelics are kind of removing this reality filter, so that we can access this sort of mystical higher knowledge?
I think it surprises many how some of the greatest thinkers were experimenting with these drugs. I mean, the first scientific psychonaut, as I call him, was the local man, Sir Humphrey Davy. He was a chemical philosopher. We'd call him a chemist today. But in 1799, he was experimenting heavily with nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and he was taking a lot of it in 1799 to the extent where he, on Boxing Day 1799, he stepped into an airtight box like a TARDIS and inhaled 160 pints of the gas. And as he stepped out, he took another 40 pints just to be sure, And then he said, the fascinating thing is, and this is all reported in this book of 1800 and his notebooks of the time. He said, everything, all that exists is thoughts, right? So, and by which he meant idealism, which is a philosophical stance from Kant again, related to the word noumena, which is the view that the matter and the space and the time we see around us is actually a projection of our minds, projection of thought, as it were. Mm-hmm. So these, at the start of the scientific investigation into psychedelics, we see an immediate link to kind of metaphysics, the fundamental study of reality, which often involves the mind. And so we have this idealism immediately coming through with the first studies of psychedelics. And that was linked to the German philosophers of the time. So Humphrey Davy was he's known as a great chemist. He was the second scientist to be knighted after Newton, and he discovered barium and a number of other elements, and he invented the miner's safety helmet and safety lamp, and so on. But he was friends with Coleridge, with the poet Coleridge, Wordsworth, De Quincey to some extent, Robert Southey, the poet laureate, and most of these, in fact, all of these were very much interested in the German idealism current at the time, especially Kant's transcendental idealism. So we see that, but academic philosophy in England, at least, doesn't become idealist for another 70 years in the 1870s with people like MacTaggart and Green and Bradley and people like that. So it seems that the psychedelic is can offer a direct experience of what can later intellectually be understood. But I think there's a good case to bring them back together again. So I think psychedelics are a great tool to augment metaphysics and the philosophy of mind. I mean, how can you really study the philosophy of mind without exploring, the great vast realms of the mind? It just seems like, being a traveler but staying in one state, something like this.
Yeah, I mean, but don't you think, haven't we all had those experiences that seem to make sense under some sort of compound, but later, in sobriety, it's like, what was I thinking? I mean, I was out of my mind. I was out of my head. How could I be thinking that?
No, well, for sure, psychedelics also induce hallucinations. I mean, I've seen an octopus turn into a town, for example, and I'm not saying that has any veridical value, but that's not to say that it's all hallucinations. So I think the first thing one should keep in mind is that, as we were saying before, the mind is a filter, or perception is a filter of reality, which means that the world we see around us all the time in our prosaic common consciousness, our consensus world, that is, in a way, a hallucination itself. And when we take, psychedelic experiences, there's not one thing, it's so vast in itself. There are so many varieties of psychedelic experience to be mapped, but certain varieties then, I think, might yield a more objective perception upon the world. For example, the distortion of time. There's no reason why our present, like the species present, should be the duration it is. There's no reason that we should perceive time at the same speed or the rhythm that we always do. In fact, again, this physicist Ravelli, I was reading his book because he said that it was his experience of LSD and the distortions of time that it produced that made him wonder, well, what is time? Is our ordinary understanding of time correct? And in his book, he says, no, it's actually our not common intuition of space and time is completely wrong. It's just a very human, all too human vision. So could it be that psychedelics actually break this consensus hallucination and give us greater direct insights into the nature of reality? I think in certain cases, but not all cases, this can happen.
Yeah, wasn't it Einstein who said reality is merely an illusion, albeit a persistent one?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah,
I believe so.
So what's happening in this state where, let's say you're drinking ayahuasca and you're moving through this, I don't know, this hallucinogenic reality space where you're sort of collecting information that wouldn't be available to you unless you were on this compound, on this drug. How is that occurring?
Well, the active ingredient in ayahuasca is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And I recently read and reviewed a book called Alien Information Theory, which concerns how DMT and its relationship to space. So one thing that numerous DMT reports show is this vision of hyperspace, and by hyperspace is meant more than 3 dimensions of space. So could this again be not a mere hallucination but a veridical perception? Why do I say that? Surely space is only 3-dimensional, right? And time might be the 4th dimension, as Minkowski and Einstein say. Mm-hmm. Well, if you go back into the history of dimensional space, you'll see that Kant, again, first in 1747, in his very first publication, said, the fact that space has 3 dimensions seems completely arbitrary, and its investigation is one of the greatest things that mankind can do. In 1854, a mathematician called Bernard Riemann, he showed that assuming that there are more than 3 dimensions of space does not lead to contradiction and paradox, as people have assumed, but can create very coherent geometries. And Euclid was wrong about the 5th fifth postulate, that parallel lines never meet, and then this continued, and Einstein adopted Riemann's mathematics to understand space and time, or space-time as it became known. A guy called Kaluza, he wrote a paper and sent it to Einstein, showing that if we assume a fourth dimension of space, the Einstein's theories of relativity cohere with the theories of electromagnetism, Maxwell's, and Einstein accepted this. And then quantum physics came along, and people didn't think about these extra spatial dimensions directly for a while. But then in the 80s, you had string theory, which said, okay, if we accept that there are 10 dimensions, then we can bring together Einstein's relativity with quantum physics, which famously don't cohere. And then M theory in the 90s said that actually it's 11 dimensions. And people are still working on this. So it's a sort of a hypothesis that hasn't yet been proved, but if it were right, it would explain the coherence. So many mathematicians and physicists really believe in these extra dimensions, but of course we can't see them because, again, we've evolved, we project the 3 dimensions of space. Some people might be able to see more than 3 dimensions. This is an interesting question. Charles Hinton wrote books on how to develop that visualization. But here's the interesting thing. So with DMT then, and other psychedelics, but DMT especially seems to be that people can suddenly visualize more than 3 dimensions of space. In other words, hyperspace. Could this be then, the interesting question is, could this be a veridical perception rather than a hallucination, considering the fact that physicists generally believe that there are far more than 3 dimensions in reality anyway? Mm. So, that's just one way in which one can see psychedelics as offering more of an insight into direct reality rather than hallucination.
Peter, I really enjoy your work because it sort of connects these parallels. I mean, I never would think that these ancient philosophers were using mescaline or any of these things that you've detailed. But, what I want to ask is, do you feel or believe that there could be a type of war on consciousness because of how hidden this is in our society?
That's an interesting question. I mean, first of all, I'd say this, that there was a sort of war on consciousness in the 20th century because a lot of people just didn't like it because it did not fit in with established theories. So you had crazy theories in retrospect, like eliminativism, which said that consciousness didn't even exist, or behaviorism, which said consciousness didn't really exist. It was simply like a word like happiness simply referred to smiling or laughing or something like this. All of these theories led to horrible paradoxes, though, and of course are very contrary to common sense. So that war on consciousness was fought, and it seems that consciousness won with the hard problem of consciousness, coined as such in 1995, as I mentioned. Could there be a war on consciousness with regard to psychedelics? Quite possibly, yeah, because I think that psychedelics impede certain conservative ways of thinking. That there must be an order and things must be structured in a traditional way and so on. They sort of allow for very creative thinking, and they also allow for a real objective viewpoint of the ideology in which one lives. The Nobel laureate Octavio Paz wrote about this, actually, in terms of moral ideology. He said, and with regard to Nietzsche, he said, psychedelics destroy this moral ideology. They make it a farce. They make it seem completely absurd. Now, what morality is a completely different question. But if we take it in that sense, then of course there would be many people who want to maintain a certain ideology or a certain morality or a certain political way of thinking, who would see a mass kind of intake of psychedelics as very threatening. And this also, of course, the church, like I said, if the church had a monopoly on spiritualism or metaphysics, and then suddenly people said, you know what, we don't need you. We can go directly to the source, as it were. That would be a threat as well. And then you see a sort of coalition between conservatism and the church, which is basically Catholicism is that already, But I could certainly see a big attack against psychedelic consciousness were it to become too prevalent, as happened in the 60s. I think another factor, though, today is that we are, unlike the 60s, well, no, that's not true. Another factor today is people are pushing the therapeutic medicinal value of psychedelics, and so it's very hard to maintain morality and be against therapy. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to predict which way this will go.
Yeah,
but at the moment, it's becoming liberalized, obviously.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned the therapeutic aspect of this, because something that I bump into a lot is a person that is in a situation where Western medicine has, all but failed them. They just, there's no direction for them to go. They've tried every antipsychotic medication that there is, and nothing seems to connect or work for them. And so, a story that I encounter quite often now, it's no longer surprising, is someone who is making a push towards going down to Peru and having a session with ayahuasca, and then someone who actually goes there, has this session with a shaman. The shaman seems to lead them through this healing process, and finally it seems like their lives turn a corner.
Yeah, no, it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, even if there's no physiological tracing of that change, it's like it's the mere experience itself, which can be correlated, of course, but psychologically speaking, it's the experience itself. It's just so refreshing in a way. I mean, again, like I say, there are varieties of psychedelic experience, but just to know that the vision of a leaf, for example, can be so extraordinarily beautiful and sublime. And, for many people, even such a simple thing can be, life-changing. To see how powerful aesthetics can be, how much the beautiful can be appreciated, is a life-changing thing. I remember when I first took psilocybin from Liberty Caps, I just thought, wow, I'm really going to have to get into history and theology and art and look at the philosophy of mind in respect to this more detail. It's incredibly inspiring. And anything inspiring, of course, is going to help your mental health, I should say. There's one danger, though, to only focus on the medicinal value of psychedelics. That is certainly a very positive aspect of them, but it's only one aspect. There are, and this is of course what I'm looking into, like other useful aspects to it as well, valuable aspects like its application to metaphysics, like I say, and philosophy of mind and art and so on and so forth. So I understand why people are pushing this medicinal point of view to make them more acceptable, but we have to remember that this is not their only purpose. They are much more. I often say psychedelics are much more than medicine.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting that you have that frame of mind, to come at it in more than just a perspective of medicinal, because it seems like that is where everyone else is. Everyone is talking about how psychedelics can help you in some sort of mental way, but you're saying that there is also a perceptive quality that can change based on our usage of these compounds. Yeah,
there is. Like I say, they have very, very strong philosophical value that is to be still to be mined, and not that of course I'm not against the medicinal use of it, but I should just stress that we need a balance, and we need to realize that there's much more. And also I should add as well, in limited cases, psychedelics can actually cause psychological damage, not physically, not physiologically, but mentally. I mean, I have met some people who have been scarred by their sort of hell-like gothic experiences, which I've also had, but they didn't affect me. I thought they were just kind of cool, you know. But some people, especially if you've been inculcated into like a religious family and you believe that there really is a hell or demons and think, you know, this kind of a dark stuff. If you've been brought up that way and then you actually see it and you have what William James calls a noetic experience where you think it's real, as it were, this, of course, can cause a lot of psychological damage. But I should stress that is rare. And, of course, alcohol can cause that as well. I mean, okay, not as in such a dark way, but it's much more harmful on average. Overall, psychedelics are very beneficial, but one has to be a bit careful to balance it.
So a person should be aware of their own sort of mental agency and know, you know, what their limits are and I mean experimentation. And you talk about how, you know, even in ancient times the state regarded doing it outside of a ritual context as, you know, a breach of some sort of agreement that was you know, necessary. You know, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean they are very powerful tools. You know, they should be handled with respect and not fear, but I should say respect. They're not party drugs. You know, like cocaine. Psychedelics are, you know, imagine if, I mean, sometimes I say it like this, imagine if someone offered you a pill and said, listen, if you take this pill, you'll have a mystical experience like the great mystics of past ages, you know. You wouldn't take that when you are, you know, you shouldn't take that really, at least when you're going to a party or traveling on a bus or something like this, you know. I think one should treat it with a lot of respect because of their power and the unexpected phenomena that can occur when taking them. So I always caution respect, not fear, but respect for these compounds.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it seems like it would be necessary to have a ritualized, you know, context to using these compounds and a reverence.
Yeah, I certainly think a ritualized context is advisable for probably most people. However, there's also, I mean, to balance that even, there's a lot of people say that, you know, taken in darkness by oneself after, you know, not the first time, obviously, but, you know, one is accustomed to them, that is the greatest experience. You need complete kind of stoppage of all external perception so that you can focus, you know, on the inner workings, as it were. I mean, I always think that psychedelics with eyes closed is much more sublime and epic than psychedelics with eyes open. You know, with eyes open, you can see, you know, plants, you know, sort of waving about and walls fluctuating and so on and so forth. But eyes closed, I mean, wow, the things that can come to you with eyes closed alone, in other words, without interference from the outside, as it were, it's just can be so phenomenal. I mean, I've experienced sort of traveling through galaxies, seeing the most amazing crystalline sort of giant spaceships which somehow seemed sentient, traveling through these strange glass escalators in an alien world and seeing multicolored vortexes. I mean, it's just a lot of people. I say this because a number of people who have never tried psychedelics think it's just sort of pretty kaleidoscopic colors, you know, as you see in certain 60s films. But it's so much more than that, you know. It's sometimes I see. I remember one phase, as it were, of a session where I just saw every now and again. I suddenly saw like a pang of the most beautiful form, you know, object. One of them was even a robot, strangely, you know. So, but it was just the most perfect shape, and just also, I mean, the emotions and feelings that can accompany that. You know, you can have feelings that you've never had before, that you can't really describe as feelings. You get this fusion of a perception and a conception at the same time. Like I said, possibly seeing space angled to a right angle to the three dimensions we already know, seemingly communicating with other beings, that are not of this world. I mean, all of these things happen, but I think happen much more easily with eyes closed. So there's a little kind of advert for doing it alone, as it were.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, Peter, I wanted to ask you what your concept of God was. I mean, when we talk about these connotations of these unperceivable realities, like that can only be accessed through these compounds, what is your perception of God, and how has that changed after the usage of these compounds?
Yeah, well, I'm still in conflict about that guy, actually, because so I'm half Swedish, half British, and both of those countries are very secular, really, even though we've got the Church of England here. Very secular countries, and I was sort of de facto brought up as an atheist. I was never told that atheism is true. It's just that, obviously the church is wrong. And then to add to that, I started reading Nietzsche as a teenager, and Nietzsche famously said, God is dead. And he goes beyond atheism and says, actually, not only is it absurd, it's actually a real danger to the human race, Christianity and its morality. And I've got that sort of embedded within my psyche now, this sort of Nietzscheanism. At the same time, I, like I said, I'm a big reader of Alfred North Whitehead, who died in 1947, and he had a sort of new conception of God, which instigated something known as process theology, which is started off in California, really, in Claremont, where I was a few months ago. And his form of God is not really the Christian form, although process theology sort of made it Christian again. It's a kind of pantheistic God in a way. And I'm more sympathetic to that. Or I'm more sympathetic to Spinoza's God. Spinoza said nature is God. So if you're going to call God nature, fair enough. But the real question is, I think, could there be an overall, a sort of overarching sentience, which is the universe, or which transcends the universe? Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly certain psychedelic experiences tend to push one in that direction. You can call it the Godhead, you can call it the Absolute. There's many names for it, and I haven't quite had a full-on experience of that, but so quite close. But the problem with the word God is it's got all these connotations, hasn't it, to the religions and whatever, sure. All of which I think are quite wrong. Although I'm not sure about that, of course. But in my experience, at least, they haven't shown any real strong reasons for believing in them. So I'm just going to stay agnostic on that.
Okay, understood. I mean, it's interesting to me, this idea, and pursuing it. I mean, it's almost as if that there's this pursuit. You're pushing the edge of madness to get this idea, a glimpse of divinity, taste the divine, to I don't know, to have this direct mystical experience of God, or what you think may be God. I want to get into, we're about to close up here, but I want to talk about synchronicity and Carl Jung and his and he coined the word. Yeah. What is your understanding of synchronicity, and what did Carl mean when he talked about that?
Well, I must admit, I'm not a Jung scholar, and I don't really know that much about it. I mean, I would consider Jung more of a psychologist than a philosopher, so it's not really something sure. I can talk about. But as I understand it, it means not merely coincidence, but that there is a higher purpose to what we experience as coincidences.
Right.
I'm going to stay agnostic on that. I can't claim that I know much about Jung, know enough about Jung at least to be able to pronounce anything on that. I think that something related to it is true, though. I think there could be purposes or teloi, of which we act upon, which are overarching, as it were, but which we're not consciously aware of. I mean, a common example is simply the urge to mate, So although we see that from our perspective as just mere pleasure, there seems to be a species-wide telos directing us that way. And then the question is, could there be even higher purposes that direct us, which we try to understand just in an individualistic sense, but actually which exist on a higher level? I mean, we're going up to levels of God again now. I think there's possibilities for that, but at the same time, I'm Kantian to the extent that I think that we are like insects trying to work out a game of chess. We can see the pieces, we can see them move, but we've got no idea that they're a game. We've got no idea about the moves, the rules, and the techniques that can be had, and the glory of victory and things like this. So I think such things like synchronicity and higher teleology and so on and so forth, we humans, as of yet, we're just not yet equipped to judge one way or the other. Although, of course, we can speculate, and of course, we can hope that we will evolve, into greater beings in the future, which perhaps then have greater cognitions. Mm-hmm. This is part of what in philosophy we call transhumanism.
Sure.
And posthumanism, the hope for greater minds to understand, the greater universe.
Yeah, the way that I've looked at it as is that, there's this sort of peephole of consciousness and this door of perception, and psychedelics seem to, lift that veil, as it were, just for a brief enough period where you're seeing behind the door for a little while. Yeah. But then, coming back to sort of quote unquote reality, coming back to the state, it's hard to retain that information. It's hard to bring it back.
Yeah. It's hard to believe some of it as well. But you have to remember that, again, William James said that under the one of the four main marks of the mystical state was what he calls the noetic quality, which is the belief that what you are experiencing at the time is real, it's veridical, it relates to an objective existence, which is not mind dependent, not dependent on your own mind. And when you get out of that state, you lose that noetic quality, and then you judge things according to your own epistemology, theory of knowledge, right? So then you start thinking, well, that can't be true because, God is not real or something like this. In other words, you're using your culture's beliefs and your own personal limited understanding, and perhaps also your character, like your pessimistic or optimistic character to judge things. And it seems that there's no real pure neutral state by which one can judge things, really. I think one thing one should always be aware of, though, is how our human knowledge and science is continuously changing, continuously getting closer and closer, it seems, although there could be paradigm shifts, of course, blah, blah. But, to think that our present state of knowledge is complete, is final, mm-hmm. is absurd, of course. And this is, in philosophy, this is known as pessimistic induction. The fact that in the past we've always been wrong sort of should give us a warning that today what we think is right is actually probably completely wrong as well. And when you look at the latest findings in science, much of this appears as more magical than any magic of the 19th century, mm-hmm. but it turns out to be quite valid. And a lot of the sort of hardcore beliefs of the past are just today's shadows of ignorance. So that's why I like Whitehead in a way. He's a speculative metaphysician, and he says we can explain these things if we assume this, that, and the other, although that's quite radical. But we have to understand that whatever the truth is, it's going to be very, very radical. I mean, the hard problem of consciousness, whatever the solution to that is, it's going to be extreme. It's going to be something that no one today would probably believe, or very few people would believe. Sure. And so, with that in mind, one can start taking the experiences of psychedelics a little more seriously, at least in their creative aspects, and the fact that they can lead to creative thought further speculations, and in the fact that they can make one connect concepts that are usually completely distinct. So in that creative aspect alone, they are valuable tools for the progress of mankind.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that to wrap this up with, Peter. Thank you so much for your time, man. Where can people find your work?
Well, I've got a website called philosopher.eu. My Twitter handle is Peter Sjöstedt-H. I've got a big philosophy Facebook group called Ontologistics. That's also a YouTube channel. If you want to find me in real life, I'm a research fellow at Exeter University. And at Exeter University, you might be interested to hear, I'm actually, me and some others are organizing a Philosophy of Psychedelics conference in April 2020. It should be, I think it's the first ever conference on the philosophy of psychedelics. And it's gonna be epic. It's gonna be great, and we're planning it now. So spread the word.
Yeah, man, it sounds great. And the book is called Noumenautics. My guest, Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-H. Had some trouble with the name. Finally got it. Peter, thank you so much for your time. Guys, we're going to get out of here. We will be back next week for another live broadcast for you guys. If you're not subscribed to us on YouTube, please search for the Human Experience Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to us. Click the bell so you get notified when we go live. If you're listening to this on the podcast version, go over to iTunes, leave us a review, positive or negative, whatever you think about the show. It helps us stay relevant. One of the common themes that I'm getting for many of you that find the show is that you wonder where we've been and how you didn't discover us earlier. So we would really appreciate that. Thank you guys so much for listening. We're going to see you next week.